let's turn now to the study. This is Romans chapter 14 study, Romans Unplugged, Feasts and Fasts and Food, oh my. And we're in this paragraph where we've been talking about, we just finished this quote from a gentleman who feels that the context of the weak and the strong in Romans 14 are the same people that he's talking to in that Paul is talking to in 1 Corinthians chapters 8 and chapter 10, which use similar verbiage and language. And I made a quote from that gentleman last week. Go back and listen to last week's audio or watch the YouTube video, and you'll see that. So let's pick up now my own commentary here, and we'll work our way down through a little bit of this. Let me see if there's a way for me to tell what I'm doing by way of time. I think I've been going for about 20 minutes, so we'll see what I can do here. If I go a little bit over, I apologize. But in my own commentary, right, as I mentioned, I mentioned this last week, or I made allusion to it, but we'll just pick it up now. As we've just seen, to be sure, there indeed exist many valuable parallels in the applications and admonitions between the two Pauline writings, right? Chapter 14 of Romans and chapters 8 and 10 of 1 Corinthians. And yet I'm not fully convinced, like some commentators, that the weak and the strong of Romans 14 are the same weak and strong in 1 Corinthians. So again, I could be wrong, and it's not really a huge deal, the difference between the two. I'm simply letting you know my position, and as you know, interpretation drives application, right? How you interpret the Bible is going to drive how you apply the Bible. And so I have a slightly different interpretation. It's not outside of the Christian norm. There are lots of Christian commentators who believe that Romans 14, the congregation and the congregation at Corinth, are two different people groups, but I'm just letting you know my opinion here. A few bullet points here. Are going to highlight some of my own personal and observable differences between the Corinthian chapters and the one here in Romans 14. So let's look at a few of my bullet points that I've highlighted here in my commentary. Number one, and these are not exhaustive, they're just a few that I put together in this particular study. So let's look at these. And if this convinces you that they aren't the same group, great. Wow, you've adopted my opinion. But if this doesn't convince you, then that's fine. Like I said, I have no serious disagreement with people who hold to the position that they're talking about the same types of people group. I just feel that they're not. The primary context of the Corinthian passages deals with eating food offered to idols. You can read about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1, where Paul says, now concerning food offered to idols. And he says it unmistakably, right? It's unambiguous. No equivocation going on there. And 1 Corinthians chapter 8, 1 Corinthians chapter 8, food offered to idols, and how that impacts the conscience of the weak and the strong. So we definitely know that's what he's talking about there. Second bullet point. The passage here in Romans 14 mentions nothing about idols or food offered to them, right? By comparison, the Corinthians passages use Greek words rendered into idol or idolatry nearly a dozen times. I will say that perhaps there's a context of the food that's mentioned in Romans 14 when he talks about all things are clean. And when we get down to that particular verse, it's possible that he's referencing the concept that would have been known to them, that all foods are undefiled or untainted with idolatrous activities, even though those who would have a weak conscience, such as those who in Corinth, would believe that food offered to idols is now somehow unclean in and of itself as well. But we know that from reading the 1 Corinthians 8 and 10 passages that Paul, the overall message was, even though he didn't want believers participating in table fellowship with pagan practices, he didn't want believers attending pagan rituals, and you can't eat the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons, he tells us in those particular passages, right? You can't partake of the table of the Lord and the table of demons. This would be wrong. But the overarching message is that Paul told us in those same Corinthians passages that the idols are nothing. They aren't really gods. I mean, they're demonic entities, so in that sense they are something, but in the perspective of God as the only true God, they are nothing. And in fact, the idols are simply representations, they're three-dimensional representations of demonic entities. They're stand-ins, they're what we today would call like icons, or what's that movie? They are I'm drawing a blank. They are they're avatars. That's the word I was looking for. We have a modern movie called Avatar. So the idol itself, the carved wooden or metal object itself, is a three-dimensional representation. It's an avatar of the demonic entity. But even in of itself, that metal or wooden object itself is nothing. Right? It's just a piece of wood or a piece of metal. I keep saying plastic, but that's not right. That's a modern way of thinking. I don't think they had plastic idols back then. So the point Paul's trying to make is that food offered to these idols really is still food. It's in the end, it is good food. You could cause some confusion with eating it because of the weak conscience of the brothers involved, but that's a whole matter altogether. So we could possibly pull that context into the Romans 14 passage, but he doesn't use the word idol or idolatry or anything like that, and that's the point I'm trying to make. Bullet point number 3, the careful Bible student will also instantly notice that unlike the 1 Corinthians 8 chapter, the 1 Corinthians 10 chapter does not utilize either the Greek or English terms weak and strong. So we do have the term weak and strong, or the Greek versions of them, showing up in one of the chapters, right? But not in the other. And yet between the two chapters, Paul uses Greek terms that are translated in English as conscience up to 8 times. So it's interesting that in terms of we could say that this is a focal point of the Corinthian chapters, is the conscience of people, not necessarily the status as strong or weak, but the conscience itself as being categorized as strong or weak. Additionally, as can be observed by comparing the two letters and their addressees, the Corinthians seem to comprise a majority Gentile population with familiar ties to their former pagan lifestyle and its instant access to pagan temples and meat markets. Indeed, the church at Corinth included some Jews. We can read about that in 1 Corinthians 7:18 and 19. But it was largely composed of Gentile converts to Christianity. Read 1 Corinthians 6:9 through 11, 1 Corinthians 8:7, as well as 1 Corinthians 12:12. So you'll catch the context of the Corinthian addressees. You know that they are largely Gentile populations with familiar ties to their former pagan lifestyles. These Corinthian Christians likely would have not had strong compulsions to retain supposed ties to the heritage religious practices of the minority Jews, the feasts and the fasts and the Sabbaths and other special days that we read about in the Romans 14 passage, right? In point of fact, I go on to say in my next bullet point, let me scroll up a little bit here. In point of fact, the opposite was probably true when we're talking about these Corinthian Gentiles. The church at Corinth was much too cozy with the dominant culture for Paul's liking. And that's probably what prompted him to write a good portion of the letter, is to help them to realize that as servants of Messiah, they need to be in the world but not of the world, right? They need to understand their call to live holy and separate lives and conduct their manner of lifestyle in a way that separates them, so that there's a line of demarcation between them as believers and the pagan idolatry all around them. I go on to say, by engaging in litigation, patronizing prostitutes, and participating in pagan cultic meals, the Corinthians were conforming to the behavior patterns of the larger society, something that Paul deemed wrong. In this first letter, I say, Paul urges them to foster a sense of being at odds with the world. Like I said, in the world but not of the world. We need to be separate. We need to be come out from among them, like Israel was told of old. Lastly, as in my second to last bullet point, food offered to idols was something that was known to be quite abhorrent on multiple levels and for multiple reasons to religious Jews of the first century. And of course, this would include not just Jews in Corinth, but it would include Jews at Romans as well, of which a longtime Bible study buddy, a friend of mine, and I were chatting just before the tonight's study about how that it's helpful to remember that in Rome, the majority of Jews in that congregation would have probably comprised they wouldn't have been the majority. They would have been the minority, owing to the fact that a few years earlier than the letter being penned, or around that time period, probably within the 5 or 10 year time frame range, Emperor Claudius had expelled the Jews from Rome, and they had trickled back into Rome. Otherwise, who could Paul be writing to when he talks to Jews at Rome? So there were those Jewish presence in Rome, but they were the minority now, in and among these Gentile majority groups. And yet still, they would not have come back to a majority Gentile population where they just simply yielded to the majority and said, oh, well, paganism is in, Judaism is out, let's just go, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. No, they wouldn't have done that. They were fiercely monotheistic, strictly in adherence to the Torah that Moshe had handed down to them. They were very devoted. There was the whole works of the law concept going on in the first centuries, retaining our semblance of Torah observance and connection to our heritage religion as Jews. And so they were very unlikely to be yielding to the paganism and things like that. So food offered to idols was definitely something that would not have presented a challenge. Paul would not particularly have to warn Jews, is what I'm trying to say, in Corinth about eating meat that was offered to idols. It simply would have been kind of wasted ink on his part. No, the admonition to avoid food offered to idols, if at all possible, or to avoid participation in the pagan rituals and things like that, this was primarily directed to Gentile believers, and that's kind of understandable. And then the final bullet point in this particular part of my commentary says, while it might be plausible that secular Jewish members of the congregations either at Corinth or Rome would have engaged in eating food offered to idols, right? It's plausible. We have secular Jews in any city that you encounter, people that aren't really connected to their religion as Jews and don't really care about the religious practices of religious Jews. They're not really, we'd say, Torah observant, or they wouldn't be defined by religious Jews as Torah observant and things like that. Maybe they go to synagogue twice a year on Passover and on Yom Kippur, but other than that, they just live their lives according to the way they feel that their lives should be dictated. Secular Jews. So while it's possible that they may have engaged in eating food offered to idols, it is highly unlikely that any religious Jewish addressees of Paul's letter to Corinthians or Romans would have done the same, right? Offered to idols. And the differences between these places and the behaviors of their citizens helps to determine the identity of the weak and the strong in Romans 14, in my opinion. All right, so having said that, give me a second. Let me see if there's a way for me to, let me see if I can see how long I've been recording. Yeah, okay. All right, good. That's exactly what I wanted to see there. Okay. Hide that. Give me a moment here. Show the toolbar. Okay, how do I hide that? Oh, well, I guess it's there to stay. Let me just move it out of the way then, because I don't remember how to hide it. Sorry about that. All right. So let's keep reading. What we're going to look at now is I'm going to read. Do I have time to read this? No, this is a good place to stop. 30 minutes into this particular part. Next week, we'll start into this particular part of the commentary. It's a subheading chapter called Who Are the Weak in Faith? Christian Perspectives. And if you've read ahead in my commentary, what you'll notice is that I look at about 2 or 3 prominent Christian commentators from today's Christian commentators to this particular chapter in Romans, and they outline their viewpoint on who the weak in faith are. Again, in closing down this part of my commentary, segment 1, it is no secret that most people, Christian and Messianic alike, in fact, nearly across the board, most people, myself included, define the strong as believers. Whether they're Jewish believers or Gentile believers, it doesn't really matter, but both of them are definitely strong because Paul includes himself among the strong in Romans chapter 15. He said, we who are strong, first person, right? So, we know that the strong are the Christians, but who are the weak? Are they Christians? Are they Jews? Are they Gentiles? That's the question that we're having, and we'll begin looking at that starting next week.